It began as a whisper through the canyons of Los Angeles, one that would soon turn into a scream. In the early hours of August 9th, 1969, the city of dreams awoke to a nightmare so grotesque it shattered the illusion of peace that had defined an entire generation. 5 bodies, endless blood, a pregnant woman pleading for her unborn child. The scene on Cielo Drive was more than a crime. It was a message, written in fear, carved into the heart of America. According to official records, the victims, actress Sharon Tate, her friends Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, and an innocent visitor named Stephen Parent, were slaughtered without mercy. The killers left behind cryptic words scrawled in blood: pig, helter-skelter, 2 words that would come to symbolize the end of the 1960s, the death of innocence. But behind those words lay something deeper, darker, a vision born from the mind of one man, a failed musician, a drifter, and a self-proclaimed prophet who saw himself as both savior and destroyer. His name was Charles Manson. He wasn't simply a murderer. He was a reflection of his time, a broken mirror of the counterculture. Peace turned into violence, love twisted into obedience, faith into fanaticism. What began as a commune of lost souls on a decaying movie ranch would soon become the most infamous cult in American history. In this story, we'll journey beyond the headlines and into the dust and delirium of the California desert to understand how a man with a guitar and a dream of apocalypse seduced a generation into madness. Because the truth of the Manson family is not just about murder. It's about control. It's about belief. And it's about what happens when charisma becomes a weapon. This is not merely a tale of death. It's the story of how one night turned a nation's hope into horror, and how, decades later, the shadow of Charles Manson still lingers, whispering through the ruins of an era that promised love but delivered blood. Long before the world knew his name, Charles Manson was a ghost drifting through America's forgotten places. He had spent more than half his life in prison, learning the language of control from con men, pimps, and preachers. By the time he was released in 1967, he was no longer a man. He was a shape, a presence, a voice that knew how to slip into people's minds and make them see the world as he did. Broken, corrupt, and ready for rebirth. When Manson arrived in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, the streets pulsed with music, drugs, and idealism. It was the summer of love, but beneath the flowers and slogans lay a generation searching for meaning. To the young and lost, Manson appeared as a guide. He carried a guitar, sang haunting melodies, and spoke of freedom from the chains of the system. His message was intoxicating. Forget your past. Forget your name. The world is ending, but we can be reborn. Among those who followed were women who had abandoned families, students who had dropped out of college, and wanderers seeking truth through LSD and rebellion. He called them his family. They called him father. He told them the desert was calling, that they would soon find a place to wait out the coming storm. That place would be Spawn Ranch. Spawn Movie Ranch had once been a bustling Western film set, a sun-bleached graveyard of saloon fronts and broken wagons. By 1968, it belonged to George Spahn, an elderly and nearly blind ranch owner who allowed Manson and his followers to live there in exchange for chores, and for the company of young women who doted on him. Among the crumbling movie props, Manson's family created their own twisted utopia. Each evening, they gathered around Manson as he played guitar under the bleeding sky. He spoke in riddles, weaving fragments of scripture, pop lyrics, and apocalyptic visions into something resembling truth. "The end is coming," he said. "When the black man rises and the white man falls, the family will rise from the desert like angels." His words were part prophecy, part performance. But to his followers, many high on LSD and desperate for belonging, they were revelation. According to later testimonies, Manson used a combination of psychological manipulation, sleep deprivation, and drugs to blur the lines between reality and hallucination. He would isolate followers for days, forcing them to relive their trauma, then rebuild them in his image. "You're nothing," he would whisper. But through me, you can become everything. It was not simply control. It was rebirth through destruction. At Spawn Ranch, the days blended together. They rode horses through the dust, scavenged in dumpsters for food, and performed rituals under the stars. The women became the lifeblood of the family, devoted, obedient, and willing to die for Manson's approval. He told them the world outside was poisoned, that the government, the police, and even their parents were part of a system built on lies. Only he saw the truth. But beneath the free love facade, something sinister grew. Manson's songs turned from gentle ballads to hymns of vengeance. He spoke more often of helter-skelter, his vision of an apocalyptic race war he believed the Beatles had prophesied in their White Album. "It's all in the music," he said, his eyes burning with conviction. "They're telling us what to do." By the end of 1968, the family had become an army in miniature, armed, loyal, and unafraid of death. They practiced creeping silently through the hills, stealing cars, and invading nearby homes to train for what Manson called the revolution. The line between play and murder was fading fast. Visitors who wandered into the ranch often described the same unsettling sensation, a stillness in the air, a feeling of being watched. Some swore they saw Manson's followers move like shadows, whispering his words as if reciting scripture. One local recalled it was like walking into another world. You could feel something wrong there, like the land itself was listening. The prophet of Spawn Ranch had found his kingdom, and under the California sun, surrounded by the ghosts of old Western heroes, Charles Manson was preparing to write his own legend, one written not on film, but in blood. By the winter of 1968, the dream of the 1960s had begun to rot. The streets of America, once filled with music and protests for peace, now echoed with riots, assassinations, and fear. And in the sun-scorched valleys outside Los Angeles, Charles Manson began to shape that fear into prophecy. To his followers, he was no longer a man. He was a messiah foretelling the end of the world. The doctrine he preached came to be known as helter-skelter. Manson claimed that the world stood on the edge of an apocalyptic race war. He told his followers that Black Americans would soon rise up and kill every white person in America. But when the war ended, they would be too naive to rebuild society, too unprepared to rule. That, Manson said, was when the family would emerge from the desert, from a hidden city beneath Death Valley, and take control of the new world. It was madness cloaked as revelation, but to those under his spell, it sounded like truth. He pointed to the Beatles' White Album as proof of his divine insight. Every lyric, he said, carried secret messages coded, instructions from the universe to him personally. The song Helter Skelter wasn't about a playground slide. It was about the fall of civilization. Piggies, he told them, was about the rich. Blackbird was a call to arms for the oppressed. He played the record constantly at Spawn Ranch, interpreting each line as scripture. When Paul McCartney sang, "You may be a lover, but you ain't no dancer," Manson smiled. That means the white man's lost his rhythm. He's lost touch with the earth. His time is over. Under the desert sun, these delusions hardened into ritual. Manson spoke of blood as the key to awakening, of killing as a sacred act that would free the soul from illusion. He told them that to start Helter Skelter, they would need to commit murders so shocking that the world would tremble and chaos would spread. These deaths, he claimed, would be blamed on Black revolutionaries, sparking the war he had foreseen. His followers nodded, entranced by his certainty. It was no longer theory, it was destiny. According to witness accounts, Manson's sermons at the ranch had begun to resemble hypnotic performances. He would sit cross-legged in the sand, his eyes burning in the firelight, voice rising and falling like music. "You're all part of me," he said. "There's no death, only change. When you kill, you bring the world closer to truth." Some of the women wept, overcome with devotion. Others fell into trances, their minds unraveling under the weight of his words and LSD-fueled nights. Those who hesitated found themselves broken down through isolation and humiliation. Manson knew their weaknesses and played them like instruments. He would call a follower out before the group, force them to confess their sins, then absolve them with a kiss or a slap. It was a constant cycle of degradation and reward, a psychological cage built of love and terror. Susan Atkins later recalled, "He said we were his mirrors. That when we killed, it was him killing through us." Tex Watson, the man who would become his chief executioner, described Manson's teachings as a religion without God, just Charlie. To them, violence had become a form of prayer. By early 1969, Manson was convinced the apocalypse was imminent. He claimed the desert had spoken to him, that the family must prepare for their exodus. They began stockpiling weapons, stealing cars, and mapping escape routes into Death Valley. In secret gatherings, they rehearsed murder, sneaking into nearby homes, slashing furniture with knives, and leaving mock messages written in blood. To outsiders, it might have looked like madness. To the family, it was training for salvation. And yet, even as Manson's paranoia deepened, there were moments of eerie calm. At twilight, he would play his guitar while the women swayed around him, singing softly. The notes drifted through the canyons like ghosts. "The world's already dead," he would say. "We're just here to bury it." What no one outside the ranch yet realized was that the burial he spoke of would soon begin, not in metaphor, but in flesh. The prophecy of Helter Skelter was no longer an idea whispered through the canyons. It was a command written in blood, waiting for its first night. By the spring of 1969, Spawn Ranch had become more than a refuge. It was a kingdom, and Charles Manson sat upon its crumbling throne. To the outside world, it looked like a ragged commune of hippies and wanderers. But to those inside, it was a closed system of devotion, fear, and control. A place where individuality dissolved into the will of one man. The days at the ranch followed a rhythm of ritual and surrender. At sunrise, the family gathered to hear Manson speak. His voice low and rhythmic, like a preacher in a trance. He told them the world beyond the hills was dying, rotted by greed, racism, and lies. Only here, in this forgotten patch of dust and ruin, could they be free. "You're not children of your parents," he would whisper. "You're children of the earth, and I am the voice of the earth." The followers believed him. Many of them were young women barely out of their teens, castaways of the counterculture who had drifted through the wreckage of broken homes and disillusioned dreams. Susan Atkins had danced in strip clubs before finding Manson. Patricia Krenwinkel fled a life of loneliness and ridicule. Leslie Van Houten, once a straight-A student, arrived seeking meaning after the death of her mother. Each had been searching for love, and each found in Manson a figure who promised salvation but delivered domination. Manson used love as a weapon. He offered affection like a drug administered in doses, withdrawn without warning. Those who pleased him were rewarded with intimacy, praise, and a sense of belonging. Those who questioned him faced public humiliation or silence. He dismantled their sense of self until nothing remained but devotion. "There is no me," one follower wrote in her diary. "There is only Charlie." Drugs amplified his power. LSD trips became spiritual ceremonies, guided by Manson's hypnotic presence. He would sit at the center, a messiah among disciples, interpreting their visions, rewriting their thoughts. When a follower saw demons, Manson explained they were the pigs of the outside world. When another saw light, he said it was the birth of a new race. Under his guidance, hallucinations became doctrine. He convinced them that death was not real, only transformation. "When you die," he said, "you don't end, you move to the next vibration. If you kill, you just change the rhythm." Slowly, his twisted theology replaced morality. Murder was not a sin, it was evolution. By the time anyone realized the depth of his control, it was too late. Life at the ranch grew darker. Guns appeared. Knives were sharpened. Practice raids began under the moonlight. The family would sneak into neighboring ranches, slit the throats of animals, and paint symbols in blood on walls and fences. Manson called it tuning the frequency of fear. Some followers began to break under the strain. Paul Watkins, once one of Manson's most loyal believers, later recalled that he began to see something unhuman in Charlie's eyes. It was like staring into a reflection that didn't blink, he said. Brooks Poston described feeling an invisible pressure at night, as if the air itself belonged to him. Both men eventually fled the ranch, terrified but too indoctrinated to fully escape. Meanwhile, the women, many pregnant, most malnourished, continued to worship Manson as a prophet. They called him Jesus, Satan, and Father Time. They wrote his words into notebooks, recited them in chants, and carved his sayings into the wood of abandoned sets. Even when he grew violent, beating them, screaming that they were still too attached to the world, they thanked him for their pain. Visitors who stumbled upon the ranch described it as eerily silent during the day and alive with strange noises at night. Drumming, chanting, the sound of laughter followed by screams. It wasn't a commune, one recalled. It was a spell. The desert around Spawn Ranch began to feel cursed, an invisible boundary that marked the edge of sanity. And through it all, Manson smiled. He claimed that the universe had chosen him to reveal the truth, that every war, every riot, every death was proof his prophecy was unfolding. In his mind, he was not preparing for murder. He was preparing for resurrection, the dawn of Helter Skelter, when the old world would burn and his children would inherit the ashes. According to later testimony, Manson began using the phrase, "Now is the time," in early July 1969. The family felt it like a signal, a vibration in the air. They knew it meant the moment was coming. The final act was being written, and every soul at Spawn Ranch would play a part. All that remained was to draw the first blood. The night was hot and silent, heavy with the stillness that comes before disaster. On August 8, 1969, Charles Manson gathered 4 of his followers inside the ramshackle trailer at Spawn Ranch. The lantern light flickered across their faces. Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. Their eyes were vacant, their minds soaked in LSD and obedience. Manson's voice cut through the air like a blade. Now is the time. Go to that house where Melcher used to live. Kill everyone in it. Do it without pity. Do it as if you love them. There was no emotion in his tone, only certainty. For Manson, this was not murder. It was prophecy. Just before midnight, the group piled into a battered 1959 Ford and drove toward the hills of Benedict Canyon. The road twisted upward through shadows and silence. Kasabian later said the night felt too still, like the air was holding its breath. At 10050 Cielo Drive stood the house that once belonged to record producer Terry Melcher, the man who had rejected Manson's music. Now it was home to actress Sharon Tate and her friends. Manson had never forgiven the rejection. In his mind, the house itself had become a symbol of the establishment that mocked him. They arrived just after midnight. Tex Watson cut the telephone line and climbed a utility pole. As they approached the gate, headlights appeared in the distance. A young man, Stephen Parent, was leaving after visiting the caretaker. Watson raised his gun. "Please don't hurt me," Parent begged. The shot echoed across the canyon, and the silence of the night was broken. The killers climbed the fence and entered through a side window. Inside, the house was quiet. Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant, slept beside her friend Jay Sebring. In another room, Abigail Folger read while Wojciech Frykowski dozed on the couch. They had no warning. Watson led the charge, his voice cold. "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." He tied up Tate and Sebring with rope slung over a ceiling beam. When Sebring protested, pleading for Sharon's safety, Watson shot him point blank, then stabbed him until he stopped moving. Atkins and Krenwinkel moved through the house like shadows, dragging the others from their rooms, binding their hands, silencing their screams. Abigail Folger tried to run. Krenwinkel chased her across the lawn, knife flashing under the moon. Folger's white nightgown turned red as she fell among the bushes. Frykowski, bleeding and half-conscious, staggered toward the door, begging for his life. "I'm already dead," he murmured. Watson's blade answered him again and again until he collapsed on the porch. Inside, Sharon Tate begged for mercy. "Please," she whispered, "let me have my baby." Atkins later claimed she looked into Tate's eyes and saw something almost divine. But compassion had no place in the gospel of Helter Skelter. "You'll never have it," Atkins said, before plunging the knife into her body 16 times. Tate's blood mixed with the child's, soaking the carpet in silence. When it was over, they dipped rags into the victim's blood and painted messages across the walls: "Pig, rise, helter skelter." The words dripped like warnings, symbols of a revolution that existed only in Manson's mind. As they drove back toward the desert, the four were eerily calm. Watson hummed a Beatles tune. Atkins stared out the window, her hands trembling but her expression vacant. Only Kasabian wept. She would later say, "It was as if we had killed the entire world that night." At Spahn Ranch, Manson waited in silence. When they returned, he looked them over with faint amusement. "Do you believe in me now?" he asked. Tex nodded. The women knelt. No one spoke of the victims' names. No one dared. By dawn, the first reports began to reach the Los Angeles Police Department. A maid, arriving for her morning shift, stumbled upon the carnage. The officers who responded would never forget the sight: bodies sprawled across polished floors, blood smeared across white walls, the stillness of death inside a house once filled with laughter. One detective would later say it was like walking into hell's living room. The next day, newspapers screamed headlines that the world refused to believe. Movie star slain in ritual killing. 5 dead in Hollywood bloodbath. The words pig and helter-skelter became the lexicon of nightmares. But for Manson, it was only the first verse of his symphony of chaos. Helter-skelter had begun. The morning after the Cielo Drive killings, Los Angeles was paralyzed with fear. Radio hosts struggled to find words. News anchors spoke in trembling tones. It wasn't just a murder, it was a ritual. The brutality suggested purpose. The messages written in blood hinted at ideology. But for Charles Manson, the first act of Helter Skelter was incomplete. "They didn't do it right," he said coldly. "They were too messy. I'll show them how to do it properly." That night, August 9th, 1969, Manson gathered another group. This time, he went with them. The chosen were Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, Steve Grogan, and Clem Tufts. Linda Kasabian, still shaken from the previous night, followed unwillingly. Manson's instructions were simple. They were to spread the message, to make the world tremble. He spoke calmly, as if explaining the steps of a ritual rather than orchestrating slaughter. "We're going to show the pigs how it feels when the world ends," he said. They drove aimlessly through Los Angeles, searching for the right house. Several times, Manson had them stop, watching from the shadows as he inspected homes, muttering about energy and vibrations. At last, he pointed to a quiet residence in Los Feliz. "This one," he said. "The universe says this one." It belonged to Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, an ordinary couple who had just returned from a weekend at Lake Isabella. Manson entered first. He found Leno asleep on the couch and woke him gently, a knife pressed to his throat. "Don't be afraid," Manson whispered. "We're not going to hurt you. Just be still." Moments later, Rosemary was brought from the bedroom, confused and terrified. Manson reassured them both, pretending it was a simple robbery. Then, as if bored, he handed control to Tex Watson. "Do what you must," he said softly, "but make it beautiful." Watson obeyed. He tied Leno's hands behind his back with a leather thong and covered his head with a pillowcase. In the kitchen, Krenwinkel and Van Houten attacked Rosemary, stabbing her again and again. According to later reports, Van Houten stabbed the woman at least 16 times, most of them after she was already dead. Krenwinkel scrawled messages on the walls with blood: "Death to pigs," "Rise," "Helter Skelter," misspelled as if the apocalypse itself had lost its grammar. In the living room, Watson plunged a carving fork into Leno's stomach and left it standing upright. He then carved the word "war" into his flesh. When police arrived hours later, they found Leno's body still tied to the couch, his face eerily calm, his eyes open. As for Manson, he had already vanished into the night. After ordering the killings, he left the scene before the blood was spilled, driving off with Grogan to scout for more potential victims. They eventually abandoned the idea. Perhaps Manson realized the point had been made, or perhaps he simply wanted to savor the fear spreading through the city. When the killers returned to Spahn Ranch before dawn, Manson was waiting. No one spoke of what they had done. He smiled faintly and said, "The pig is dead. The war has begun." They ate breakfast together as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, the news broke across Los Angeles like an earthquake. 2 nights, 7 victims, the same eerie handwriting and blood, the same ritualistic violence. Detectives stared at crime scene photos in disbelief. It was like walking into a nightmare that refused to end, one said. The city's glamour dissolved overnight. Hollywood parties emptied, doors were bolted, guns were bought. For the first time, Los Angeles felt haunted. Neighbors of the LaBiancas spoke of hearing strange noises that night, laughter, chanting, the sound of footsteps fading into the dark. One woman claimed she saw a man with long hair standing under a streetlight, humming softly. When police showed her Manson's photograph weeks later, she fainted. For investigators, the 2 massacres seemed unrelated. No one could yet imagine that a drifter and his band of runaway children were behind it all. But within the dusty canyons, at Spahn Ranch, Manson's followers celebrated. They believed they had set the prophecy in motion. According to later court testimony, Manson told them, "You are the hands of fate. The old world is dying because you killed it." And for the first time, he began to believe his own delusion that he had become the voice of death itself. Helter Skelter had now written its 2nd chapter, and the pages dripped with blood. By August 10th, 1969, Los Angeles was no longer the city of sunshine and dreams. It was a city under siege. The newspapers screamed in bold black letters, "Death to pigs." 2 nights of slaughter. Hollywood in terror. Every radio station repeated the same words: ritual, blood, cult. No one could explain who or what was behind it. For the first time in decades, the heart of America's entertainment capital stopped beating. The brutality of the Tate and LaBianca murders went beyond comprehension. Detectives described scenes so grotesque they couldn't be printed in full detail. In Beverly Hills, gates slammed shut. Actors and directors hired private security, bought guns, refused to leave their homes after sunset. Steve McQueen began carrying a revolver everywhere he went. Frank Sinatra canceled parties. Roman Polanski, returning from Europe, fell to his knees when he saw the blood-soaked floor where his wife had died. "It's not real," he whispered. "It can't be real." But it was. Police worked around the clock, dividing into 2 separate teams, one for Cielo Drive, another for Waverly Drive. Neither realized they were chasing the same phantom. At first, investigators suspected drug deals, satanic rituals, even political assassinations. It had the markings of something organized, said LAPD Sergeant Michael McGann. But there was no pattern, no fingerprints, no reason. Just madness. Rumors spread faster than evidence. Hollywood gossip magazines speculated that the murders were revenge killings connected to cults, or secret Hollywood orgies gone wrong. Others whispered about the occult, about pentagrams, devil worship, and seances. A psychic was even brought in by a private investigator hired by a studio executive. "I just believe." She claimed to feel a powerful dark energy radiating from the Cielo Drive property. Reporters laughed at first, then stopped laughing when another murder occurred just miles away. The city turned inward. Flower children cut their hair. Neighbors stopped trusting one another. The peace and love generation suddenly found itself surrounded by suspicion. The Manson murders, though no one yet knew his name, had killed more than people. They had killed the illusion of innocence. Inside LAPD headquarters, frustration mounted. Detectives sifted through hundreds of leads. They interrogated friends of the victims, film producers, and drug dealers. Every theory collapsed. There was no motive that made sense. It was like chasing smoke, recalled Officer Harold Doyle. We kept finding pieces, but none of them fit. Meanwhile, at Spawn Ranch, life continued as if nothing had happened. Manson's followers sang songs, cooked food, and cared for the horses. When newspapers arrived, they cut out the headlines and hung them on the walls like trophies. Manson read the stories aloud, smiling. "Look," he said, "they're talking about us. The world knows the family now." He interpreted the chaos as validation. His plan was working. The fear spreading across Los Angeles was proof that Helter Skelter had begun. As panic deepened, the press turned the crimes into myth. Photographers camped outside the Tate residence. News vans followed every false lead. The words cult, hippies, and devil appeared side by side in bold type. The counterculture movement, once the heartbeat of the decade, began to look like its own monster. The Manson murders ended the 60s. Journalist Joan Didion would later write, "It was the moment the story broke and the world stopped believing in itself. Behind closed doors, city officials debated imposing curfews. Gun shops sold out of ammunition. Dogs barked through the night, spooked by sirens and helicopters. Los Angeles became a ghost town," said a reporter from the Times. People looked at each other in the supermarket and saw potential killers. Yet, even as fear gripped the city, the killers remained invisible. They were not shadowy Satanists or foreign assassins. They were ordinary kids from broken homes, drifting through the wreckage of the American dream. But that truth had not yet surfaced. For now, Los Angeles was caught in a fever dream of paranoia, desperate for answers. And somewhere in the desert, Charles Manson played his guitar by firelight, whispering to his followers about destiny and war. He told them, "They're afraid because they know we've already won." He wasn't entirely wrong. The city was terrified. The myth was growing, and the devil, for the moment, was still free. The investigation into the Tate and La Bianca murders was chaos from the start. 2 separate crime scenes, 2 police jurisdictions, 2 entirely different narratives, and no sign that they were connected. The Los Angeles Police Department and the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department worked in parallel, unaware that they were chasing the same ghosts. At the Cielo Drive house, detectives sifted through shards of glass, pools of dried blood, and overturned furniture. The words pig and helter skelter, smeared in crimson, offered no clarity, only madness. "We had no idea what we were looking at," said Detective Sergeant Mike McGann. "It looked like a ritual, but by who and for what? We didn't know." The press hounded investigators, demanding answers. Headlines grew more hysterical by the hour. Cult of death in Hollywood. Satan's children strike again. Furies multiplied. Satanists, communists, drug dealers, or even the mafia. But no one could explain the absence of motive. The killers had taken almost nothing. Money and jewelry were untouched. The only thing stolen was peace of mind. At the La Bianca home, the brutality was so theatrical that even hardened detectives struggled to make sense of it. A carving fork impaled into Leno LaBianca's abdomen. The word war carved into his flesh. Blood scrawled across the walls like graffiti from hell. It wasn't random, one officer said. It was communication. But we didn't know the language. For weeks, the investigation went nowhere. Witnesses described mysterious figures in the canyons, wild-eyed strangers, hitchhikers, men and women with long hair and blank stares. But none of it led anywhere. The city's hippie population became targets of suspicion. Police raided communes, interrogated musicians, and staked out nightclubs like the Whiskey A Go-Go and the Topanga Corral. Still, nothing. Meanwhile, Charles Manson and his family watched the news with fascination. They cut out articles, pinned them to the walls of their shacks at Spawn Ranch, and read them aloud like scripture. "They don't know who we are," Manson said with a smirk. "We could walk right past them and they'd never see us." He wasn't wrong. To the police, Manson was just another drifter. His name didn't appear once in the official reports. The first real break came from an unexpected place, a string of car thefts and a forgotten ranch in the desert. After the murders, Manson moved his followers to Barker Ranch, deep in Death Valley. There, they scavenged abandoned vehicles, stockpiled weapons, and waited for the apocalypse Manson promised. But when park rangers discovered the stolen cars, they alerted the local sheriff. In October 1969, officers raided Barker Ranch. They arrested dozens of people, including Manson, on suspicion of auto theft. At first, the arrests seemed trivial. No one suspected these unwashed runaways of murder. But during questioning, a few of the women began to talk. One of them, Susan Atkins, was transferred to Sybil Brand Institute, a women's jail in Los Angeles. There, she started boasting to her cellmates about the night of the pigs. She described the killings in detail, laughing as she told them how Sharon Tate had begged for her baby's life. "We did it for Charlie," she said. "Helter Skelter is coming." Word reached the authorities quickly. Detectives from the Tate task force were summoned to the jail. When they heard Atkins' story, they could barely believe it. But the details she provided, the names, the layout of the house, the words written in blood, matched the evidence perfectly. For the first time, the chaos began to form a pattern. By November 1969, the pieces were falling into place. Fingerprints from Watson and Krenwinkel were matched to evidence found at the crime scenes. Eyewitnesses placed Manson's followers near the Cielo Drive house. Ballistics confirmed that the same .22 caliber revolver had been used in both massacres. Slowly, the myth unraveled, revealing the reality beneath. The killers were not supernatural, nor part of a grand conspiracy. They were Manson's children, broken, obedient, and deadly. When police confronted Manson in custody, he smiled. "You think you caught me," he said, "but you can't catch what doesn't exist." Then, in a whisper, "I am nothing, and I am everything." By December, the names Manson and family were front-page news. Mugshots of the cult members, wild-haired, smirking, defiant, became symbols of America's lost innocence. The world finally saw their faces, and it shuddered. But for detectives, the revelation brought little comfort. The deeper they dug, the stranger the story became. They discovered hidden altars in the desert, cryptic diaries, and burned tapes of Manson's music. There were rumors of other murders' bodies buried in the sand, disappearances that matched the family's movements. The case was solved, but the questions were only beginning. As prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi would later write, it was the end of the 60s in a single stroke. The dream of peace died in the blood of strangers. Helter Skelter had a face now, and it looked disturbingly human. When the trial of Charles Manson and his followers began in June 1970, it was more than a courtroom proceeding. It was a national spectacle, a collision between America's fading innocence and its new nightmare. The murders at Cielo Drive and Waverly Drive had already become myth, but now the myth was given faces, voices, and madness. The courthouse on Temple Street in downtown Los Angeles was surrounded daily by crowds, reporters, protesters, and Manson's remaining followers, mostly women who had shaved their heads and carved X's into their foreheads in solidarity with their imprisoned leader. They sang his songs on the courthouse steps, chanted slogans of love and death, and hissed at journalists who called Manson a killer. "You don't understand him," one of them said. "He's Christ and the devil, all in one." Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Vincent Bugliosi, faced the nearly impossible task of proving that a man who had not physically committed any of the murders had nonetheless masterminded them. Manson's defense argued that his followers had acted on their own, out of drug-induced delusion. But Bugliosi built a different story, a story of manipulation, control, and prophecy. Charles Manson didn't need to kill, he said in his opening statement. His words were his weapons. His mind was the murder weapon. Manson entered the courtroom like a performer. Sometimes he smiled, sometimes he glared. On the first day, He carved an X into his forehead and told reporters, "I've removed myself from your world." His followers soon did the same. When he was denied the right to represent himself, he lunged at the judge, shouting, "You can't kill me, I am already dead." The deputies dragged him away, and the world saw what Bugliosi meant. Manson's madness was not theatrical, it was contagious. The witnesses' testimonies painted a picture so surreal it seemed unreal. Linda Kasabian, granted immunity in exchange for her cooperation, became the star witness. Her voice trembled as she recounted the horrors of both nights. The screams, the blood, Manson's chilling command. The jurors wept. The courtroom fell silent. Susan Atkins, who had once bragged in jail about killing Sharon Tate, now sat stone-faced, eyes distant, occasionally smiling as if reliving the glory of devotion. The trial stretched on for months, 7 long, chaotic months filled with interruptions, threats, and eerie displays of loyalty. Manson's followers camped outside, holding vigils, slashing their own arms with razor blades in protest. One day, they attempted to immolate themselves on the courthouse steps, only to be stopped by police. Inside, Manson continued to manipulate, whispering to his co-defendants, flashing hand signals, and grinning at jurors as if daring them to look away. Reporters described the proceedings as a circus, but underneath the madness was a profound cultural reckoning. The hippie dream of love, peace, and rebellion against authority had died in that courtroom. Manson became its ghost, the dark mirror of the counterculture. He took the message of freedom, wrote one journalist, and turned it into a weapon of control. As the evidence piled up, fingerprints, confessions, Manson's recorded ramblings about helter-skelter, the defense crumbled. Manson tried to shift blame, accusing society, the Beatles, even the prosecution of creating him. "You made me," he shouted one afternoon. "You made the monster." The words echoed through the courtroom like a curse. On January 25, 1971, the verdict was read. Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten were found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Tex Watson, tried separately, would receive the same fate. Prosody. When the sentence was announced, death in the gas chamber, Manson smirked. "You can kill me," he said softly, "but you can't kill what we are." Outside, the crowd erupted, some in relief, others in mourning for the strange, twisted cult that had fascinated and terrified a nation. The trial was over, but the story was far from finished. In 1972, California would abolish the death penalty, and Manson's sentence would be commuted to life imprisonment. He would never leave prison again. But perhaps the most haunting part of the trial was not Manson's fate. It was the realization that his power hadn't died with his freedom. Reporters who covered the case described nightmares that lasted for years. Jurors received letters signed "The Family." And in prison, Manson's words continued to spread, carried by new followers who believed his message was never about murder, it was about revelation. As Bugliosi later wrote, "We convicted Charles Manson, but we never exorcised him. He remained in the air, an idea, a contagion, a warning." The trial had ended. The myth had begun. When the doors of the Los Angeles courtroom finally closed behind Charles Manson and his followers, the echoes of their laughter lingered. For many Americans, the trial had not just revealed a crime, it had exposed a wound. The Manson murders marked a turning point. The moment when the shimmering illusion of the 1960s, its utopian dreams, its faith in love and freedom, collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The counterculture had promised enlightenment. Instead, it had given birth to a cult of death. In the months after the verdict, the collective psyche of America shifted. Once bright streets darkened under the shadow of paranoia. The phrase, "peace and love," began to sound hollow. Parents warned their children about communes, LSD, and strangers offering salvation. Rock lyrics, once symbols of liberation, were suddenly examined for hidden meanings. Even the Beatles, unknowingly immortalized in the madness of helter-skelter, retreated from the cultural battlefield, their music forever linked to murder. Writers and sociologists later described the murders as the symbolic end of the 60s. The dream had burned itself out on Cielo Drive. You could feel it. Journalist Joan Didion wrote, "The optimism, the faith in human goodness, it evaporated overnight. The idea that evil could hide behind the face of a guru, behind the smile of a barefoot girl singing hymns to peace, shattered the American imagination." But Manson's influence didn't die with the headlines. From his prison cell, he continued to receive letters, visitors, and offers of allegiance. He spoke in riddles during interviews, blending nihilism and mysticism, claiming to be both victim and prophet. "You made me what I am," he told one journalist. "I'm your reflection. I'm what happens when your children stop believing in you." Television talk shows and magazines fed the fascination. Manson became a symbol, a big cipher onto which America projected its fears. For some, he was the devil incarnate. For others, he was a scapegoat for a generation's sins. Hollywood turned the story into legend films, books, magazines, and countless massacres. And documentaries dissected every gesture, every word. Yet the more the public tried to distance itself from him, the clearer it became. Charles Manson had become part of American mythology. Meanwhile, the survivors, the victims' families, the detectives, and the jurors carried scars that never healed. Roman Polanski left the United States, very haunted by grief. Abigail Folger's parents built a foundation in her name, though they rarely spoke of what happened. Vincent Bugliosi wrote Helter Skelter, the definitive chronicle of the case, hoping to bring closure, but even he admitted that Manson's shadow seemed to grow with time. It wasn't just about one man. He wrote, "It was about all of us, and what we allowed ourselves to believe." The echoes of Spahn Ranch reverberated through the culture. Other cults emerged, Jim Jones in Jonestown, David Koresh in Waco, each echoing Manson's blueprint. Isolation, charisma, control. His methods became a study in manipulation. His name shorthand for blind devotion turned lethal. Psychologists coined terms like Manson effect to describe the way ordinary people could surrender their morality under the influence of a dominating will. And yet, for all the fear and condemnation, fascination persisted. Tourists visited Cielo Drive as if it were a shrine to something unspeakable. True crime magazines sold millions of copies featuring Manson's eyes on the cover. Wild, hypnotic, unreadable. Even behind bars, he cultivated the image of a dark philosopher. When asked if he felt remorse, he replied, "What is there to regret? The world kills every day. I just played my part." But perhaps the most haunting legacy of the Manson murders lies not in the blood, nor in the trial, but in the questions that remain unanswered. How did so many intelligent, seemingly normal people come to worship a man like him? How thin is the line between faith and fanaticism, between idealism and insanity? Manson's story forced America to confront the darkest corners of its own soul, the fragility of belief, the seduction of power, and the human hunger to belong, even to something monstrous. In the end, Manson didn't destroy America's dreams. He revealed them for what they were, fragile illusions built on the hope that evil could always be recognized, that monsters wore faces we could identify. But Charles Manson looked like any man. He smiled, sang songs, and promised freedom. And when people followed him, they found hell instead. According to official records, Manson died in 2017 at the age of 83. But some say his spirit never left. Speak, prosody rate -2%, pitch -1st. His face still stares from photographs. Break time 220 milliseconds. His name still circulates in whispers. Break time 220 milliseconds. His words still surface in the shadows of every new cult and every new tragedy born of blind devotion. Because Charles Manson was never just a man. Prosody rate -2%, pitch -1st. He was a mirror, and the reflection he left behind is one America can never quite look away from. Break time 380. Even after Charles Manson was locked behind bars, 220 milliseconds, his voice never truly went silent. From the concrete walls of San Quentin and later Corcoran State Prison, break time 220 milliseconds, he continued to speak through interviews, letters, take 220 milliseconds, and recordings. His eyes, sharp and magnetic, stared out from television screens into millions of living rooms. Break time 380. What should have been the end of a nightmare became its rebirth. The cult of Charles Manson didn't die in 1969. It evolved. Break time 380. In the early 1970s, a new generation of seekers began writing to him. Break time 380. Some were lost teenagers. Others were intellectuals fascinated by his philosophy. Break time 380. He replied to hundreds of letters, filling them with cryptic messages about the environment, religion. Break time 380. And apocalypse. He denied being a murderer, insisting he was a reflection of a violent society. You can lock up the body, he wrote, but you can't cage the truth. His words, filtered through tabloids and underground press, transformed into modern folklore. In music, too, carried his ghost, specifically Manson's background in music in 1969, desperate to break into the Hollywood scene. Afterward, bootlegs of his songs began to circulate. Artists like Guns N' Roses and Marilyn Manson, who deliberately borrowed his name, revived his melodies and myth. To some, it was rebellion. To others, desecration. But in both cases, the message was clear. Manson had transcended history and entered the bloodstream of pop culture. By the 1980s, his image had become shorthand for evil. His face, wild eyes, tangled hair, the carved X appeared on t-shirts, posters, and even tattoos. Punk rockers adopted him as a symbol of anti-establishment fury. True crime magazines resurrected his story every few months, each time reigniting fascination. He was no longer just a man. He was an archetype, a language of rebellion and corruption combined. But Manson's influence also endured in darker ways. Scholars of cult psychology traced a direct line from his methods to later groups, the People's Temple, Heaven's Gate, and the Branch Davidians. His blueprint was simple: isolate the vulnerable, dismantle their identity, replace it with faith. He turned manipulation into theology. Even prison psychiatrists admitted that his charisma remained intact. When he looks at you, one said, it feels like you're being seen by something ancient. As time passed, Manson became less a person than an idea, a living metaphor for the chaos hidden within civilization. He was quoted in anarchist circles, cited by radical environmentalists, and studied in university courses on psychology and criminology. His interviews with journalists became bizarre performances. He laughed, sang, recited poetry, and spun apocalyptic prophecies about race, war, and the death of mankind. "You think I'm crazy?" he told one interviewer. "You just haven't looked in the mirror long enough." And then came the digital age. With the rise of the internet, the Manson myth found new life. Online forums and message boards began dissecting his every word. Some users idolized him as a misunderstood prophet. Others saw him as a warning of how ideology can consume the human mind. YouTube clips of his interviews went viral, gathering millions of views. On dark corners of the web, self-proclaimed followers still quoted his writings, interpreting them through modern conspiracies. Even now, decades after his death, his voice echoes through pixels and screens. The persistence of his cult reveals an uncomfortable truth. Manson didn't invent evil. He revealed its hunger. People continue to study him, not because of what he did, but because of what he exposed: the fragility of identity, the seduction of control, the terrifying ease with which one man's madness can become another's belief. FBI analysts later described Manson as the prototype for the 20th century cult leader. His methods: psychological conditioning, emotional dependency. Spiritual theater became subjects of military and intelligence research. He had weaponized charisma. And that, perhaps, is what makes him so haunting. You can explain murder. You can quantify blood, but you can't measure the power of faith turned toxic. Even today, there are those who visit his grave, leaving flowers, candles, or fragments of song lyrics. Some do it out of curiosity, others out of reverence. One former follower who later renounced him said quietly, "You can leave Charlie, but Charlie never leaves you." Half a century later, his name still sparks unease, a reminder that evil doesn't vanish when its creator dies. It mutates, adapting to new generations, new fears, new media. Charles Manson was the prophet of Spawn Ranch, the preacher of Helter Skelter. But his truest creation was something far larger, the myth of himself. Because myths don't die. They wait, they whisper. And somewhere, in the silence between one headline and the next, the echo of that myth still calls out, asking if we've learned anything at all. The desert still holds its secrets, even decades after the family's arrest. A vast emptiness of Death Valley hums with unanswered questions. Out here, where the sun bleaches bone and wind erases tracks, people still whisper about what Charles Manson left behind: buried evidence, unmarked graves, and prophecies etched into the rock. Some believe the desert itself remembers. In the 1970s, long after Spawn Ranch had burned to ash, investigators and treasure hunters began scouring Barker Ranch, the family's final hideout. It was a cluster of decaying shacks, surrounded by dry riverbeds and haunted silence. Rangers who stumbled upon it described the place as frozen in time. Scattered clothes, children's toys, handwritten notes, and strange symbols carved into the walls. A battered Bible lay open on a table, its pages smeared with dust and oil. On one wall, scratched into the plaster, were the words, "When Helter Skelter comes, we'll rise." Rumors spread that Manson had hidden bodies in shallow graves throughout the desert. Some locals claimed to have seen the family digging at night by lantern light. Others reported hearing chanting echo across the canyon walls. The FBI conducted excavations in 1979 and again in 2008 after new tips emerged. Both times they found bones, animal, mostly, but never all of them. The desert keeps what it wants, one investigator said. Out there, even the dead get lost. To Manson, the desert had always been sacred ground. He spoke of it as a gateway, a liminal space between life and death, where the boundaries of the world blurred. He believed that when Helter Skelter arrived, the family would retreat underground to a city hidden beneath Death Valley. There, he promised, they would survive the apocalypse and emerge as rulers of the new world. Some followers swore they had seen this place in visions while tripping on LSD. It was real, one said years later. You could feel it breathing under the sand. Journalists who visited the area after Manson's arrest found eerie remnants of those beliefs. Crude maps drawn in ash, lists of chosen ones, and caves adorned with occult markings. The desert became a canvas for obsession. Every few years, new explorers return: documentary crews, conspiracy theorists, spiritual seekers, each hoping to uncover proof of what Manson promised. None ever find it, yet none return untouched. It's not about finding something, said a filmmaker who spent weeks at Barker Ranch in 1993. It's about feeling something. The silence there, it vibrates. For locals, the family's ghost lingers. Old-timers in nearby towns still recall when the cult roamed the area, stealing gasoline, breaking into cabins, leaving strange symbols painted on rocks. One retired sheriff remembers seeing Manson once, barefoot and smiling, walking along the highway. He looked like a prophet that had outlived his own prophecy, he said, like the desert itself had kept him alive. In the decades since, Barker Ranch has become both a historical site and a forbidden pilgrimage. Burned and rebuilt multiple times by vandals and believers alike, it stands today as a ruin swallowed by dust. Tourists leave offerings, candles, trinkets, sometimes pages of poetry. Some come out of morbid curiosity, others seeking understanding, but all speak of the same feeling, the weight of silence, as if the earth is listening. Modern cult researchers often cite Manson's desert years as the crucible where his theology took shape. Isolation, deprivation, and endless heat became tools of control. The environment itself mirrored his ideology: vast, merciless, indifferent. It stripped away individuality, leaving only obedience. "The desert doesn't lie," Manson once told a reporter. "It kills what's weak and keeps what belongs." Even now, whispers persist of hidden caches, buried weapons, tapes, even journals. Some former followers claim Manson predicted future wars, environmental collapse, and societal breakdowns that eerily resemble modern fears. "Charlie said the world would burn," one survivor recalled. Maybe it's still happening. And perhaps that's the true power of the Manson myth. It adapts. Every generation finds in him what it fears most: violence, manipulation, chaos. In the era of social media, the desert has become digital, and his words still echo through it, carried on screens instead of wind. Helter Skelter was never just a prophecy of war. It was a metaphor for disorder, the breakdown of meaning, the loss of truth. Standing at Barker Ranch today, the wind whistles through broken windows. The walls, blackened by fire, still carry faint carvings, hearts, crosses, spirals. The ground is littered with fragments of glass and bone. As the sun sinks below the horizon, the air grows cold, and the silence feels alive. Some say if you listen closely, you can still hear voices singing, chanting, promising rebirth. Maybe it's just the wind. Or maybe, as Manson once said, nothing ever dies in the desert. It just waits to be remembered. Psychologists who studied Charles Manson and his followers often said the same thing. His real crime wasn't murder, it was persuasion. He didn't simply order people to kill. He convinced them that killing was salvation. Understanding how he did it means confronting one of humanity's most uncomfortable truths, that under the right conditions, almost anyone can be made to obey. In the years after the trial, psychiatrists, sociologists, and behavioral scientists dissected every fragment of Manson's influence. They discovered a perfect storm of manipulation, timing, and vulnerability. The late 1960s were a time of disillusionment. Young people were rebelling against authority, searching for meaning, desperate to belong. Manson offered them what society could not: unconditional acceptance and an explanation for the chaos of the world. "You are perfect," he told them. "Only the world is wrong." But that acceptance came with a price. Once he had their trust, he dismantled their identity piece by piece. Sleep deprivation, LSD, and constant repetition eroded critical thought. Every day at Spawn Ranch followed the same cycle: isolation, confession, and reprogramming. Manson played the role of both savior and executioner, rewarding obedience with affection, punishing independence with rejection. He used love as currency, fear as control. According to court psychologists, Manson instinctively applied the same techniques later documented in military interrogation and brainwashing experiments. He created dependency through exhaustion and sensory manipulation. Followers described him talking for hours until their sense of time vanished. "He'd stare at you," Leslie Van Houten later said, "and it felt like he was seeing inside your soul. After a while, you stopped thinking at all." The most disturbing element was that his control didn't rely on violence, it relied on belief. Manson rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. His followers policed one another, correcting doubts before they could grow. To leave the family wasn't just betrayal, it was spiritual death. "He convinced us that the outside world was the lie," Paul Watkins recalled, "that only he knew the truth." Modern researchers compare Manson's methods to those seen in authoritarian regimes, extremist movements, and modern-day cults. The core mechanism is always the same: isolation, idealization, indoctrination. Once the target's reality collapses, they cling to the only truth they have left, the leader. Manson called it coming home. Dr. Margaret Singer, a leading expert on coercive persuasion, described Manson's success as a triumph of emotional conditioning. She explained that the mind, under constant psychological pressure, will eventually rewire itself to avoid pain and seek belonging, even if that belonging demands murder. The Manson family, she wrote, was not a collection of killers. It was a collective psychosis. Perhaps what made Manson truly terrifying was how ordinary his followers were. They weren't psychopaths or lifelong criminals. They were daughters, students, musicians. They had families who loved them. And yet, through a blend of charisma and chaos, he turned them into instruments of his will. The line between free will and submission blurred until it disappeared entirely. In that sense, Manson's story wasn't unique. It was human. Experiments in obedience, such as Stanley Milgram's infamous studies at Yale in the early 1960s, echoed the same conclusion. Given authority, people will harm others if they believe it serves a higher purpose. Manson didn't wear a lab coat. He wore beads and sang songs, but the principle was identical. He created an environment where disobedience felt like sin. In one of his prison interviews, Manson laughed when asked how he convinced people to kill. "I didn't," he said. "They did it because they wanted to. I just showed them who they were." His answer wasn't entirely wrong. He had built a mirror in which his followers saw not their humanity, but their potential for destruction. What makes Manson's legacy endure in psychology is that it forces us to face that same reflection. We like to believe we're immune to manipulation, that we'd never surrender our conscience to someone else's will. Yet the Manson case proves how fragile that assumption is. Under the right pressure, even the most compassionate person can be turned toward darkness if they believe it serves the light. Today, universities still teach the Manson case in courses on cult dynamics, group psychology, and moral collapse. His methods are studied not to glorify, but to warn. In an age of online radicalization, mass movements, and algorithmic persuasion, his story feels unsettlingly familiar. The stage has changed, but the script remains. In one chilling note discovered after his arrest, Manson had written, "Obedience is freedom if you never question who commands." It could have been his creed or his confession. And so, decades later, psychologists still ask the same question. Was Charles Manson born evil, or did he simply understand human weakness better than anyone else? Perhaps both. Charles Manson's story didn't end in the prison cell. It metastasized into a reflection of America itself. Every decade since the murders has found new meaning in his image. He became a shorthand for evil, a warning, a fascination. But beyond the horror, the question remained. What does Manson say about the world that created him? The 1960s were supposed to be the decade of transformation, of love, peace, and unity. But beneath the surface, the same forces that gave birth to the counterculture also birthed its shadow. Manson exploited the same hunger for freedom, the same rejection of authority that had fueled the era's optimism. He simply inverted it. Where others sought enlightenment, he offered apocalypse. In that way, he was not the end of the 60s, he was their dark reflection. Sociologists argue that Manson's rise was inevitable. The era had opened the floodgates to new religions, gurus, and experiments with consciousness, without boundaries. The search for transcendence turned inward and downward. He didn't create the madness, one historian noted. He just gave it a soundtrack. The Beatles, the drugs, the mysticism, they were all part of a spiritual revolution that lost its compass. The media, too, became part of the myth. From the moment the story broke, Manson was transformed from man to symbol. Photographs of his manic grin, his tangled beard, and his carved forehead flooded newspapers. He was painted as a devil, a prophet, a monster, sometimes all at once. Every network wanted his face. Every journalist wanted a quote. In their obsession, the media gave him exactly what he wanted: immortality. Over time, Manson's image evolved with the culture that feared him. In the 1970s, he represented the death of the hippie dream. In the 1980s, he became a cautionary tale about cults and moral decay. By the 1990s, he had morphed into a pop icon of nihilism, his face printed on t-shirts, his words sampled in songs, his name invoked by shock artists. America consumed him, rebranded him, and sold him back to itself. But beneath the layers of exploitation and fascination lies something more profound. Manson was a mirror held up to a nation, wrestling with its own contradictions. His story forced America to confront the fragility of morality, the lure of charisma, and the thin line between individual freedom and collective madness. The family's crimes didn't just expose the darkness of one man, they revealed the vulnerability of a society desperate to believe in something. Even scholars of religion found uncomfortable parallels. Manson's control mimicked the structures of faith: ritual, sacrifice, salvation. His followers didn't see themselves as killers. They saw themselves as apostles. It was theology without God. One professor wrote, he offered redemption through annihilation. The same psychological mechanisms that make saints made monsters. The fascination endures because Manson represents more than murder. He represents the failure of reason in the face of charisma, the point where ideology consumes humanity. In an age of mass media, he was among the first to understand that spectacle is power. "You made me famous," he once told a reporter. "Speak prosody rate is equal to 2%. I just played the role you wrote." That role became archetype. Today, in documentaries, films, and endless online discussions, Manson continues to appear not as a relic, but as a recurring figure in the American psyche. He's invoked every time a cult forms, every time a leader demands blind faith, every time society asks how ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil. He is both ghost and teacher, warning and temptation. Yet, perhaps the most haunting truth is that Manson understood his audience better than they understood him. Break time 380 milliseconds. He saw their hunger for meaning, their addiction to rebellion, and he fed it until it devoured them. He once said, "You all made me what I am. I'm just your reflection." And maybe he was right, in the end. The Manson story is not only about murder, it's about the mirror it holds up to us. Thirst for belonging, the thirst for belonging, the willingness to surrender judgment to the illusion of purpose. These are not aberrations. They are human. When America looked into Charles Manson's eyes, Cheetos in more, it didn't just see evil. It saw itself, staring back. There are moments in history that never truly end. They just change form, slipping quietly into the bloodstream of collective memory. The Manson murders were one of those moments. Decades later, the blood on Cielo Drive has long been washed away, but the echo of that night still reverberates through the culture. Every generation rediscovers the story and feels its chill. Every retelling opens the same wound. Charles Manson is dead, yet his name endures, spoken in whispers, printed in headlines, woven into songs, films, and nightmares. He became a symbol so vast that it no longer belongs to him. To speak of Manson is to speak of the abyss that exists between humanity and horror, between devotion and destruction. His life has become a cautionary myth, the story of a man who wanted to be God, and a society that, for a moment, allowed him to believe it. In the years since his death in 2017, Manson's ashes have scattered, but his image remains suspended in time, an artifact of evil endlessly replayed. True crime documentaries resurrect his grin. Online forums analyze his words as if decoding scripture. Each generation stares into the same darkness and wonders how it ever happened. The answers remain the same, yet they never satisfy. Because the Manson story was never just about murder, it was about the human hunger for meaning, even when that meaning leads to ruin. At its core, the Manson case endures because it reveals a paradox. that the search for enlightenment and the descent into madness can begin from the same place. The family didn't believe they were monsters. They believed they were changing the world. That's what makes their story unbearable and unforgettable. It asks us to confront the uncomfortable truth that belief itself can become a weapon, and that under the right voice, faith can twist into fanaticism. Over half a century later, the landscape of America has changed, but the echoes of Manson's sermon remain. They appear in new forms: online cults, radical movements, influencers who promise meaning in chaos. The tools are digital now, but the psychology is ancient. The same forces that made people kneel before Manson still exist: isolation, fear, longing, and the endless need to belong. His prophecy, stripped of its apocalyptic poetry, was never really about race or war. It was about control and the terrifying ease with which humans surrender it. Historians say that every era creates the monster it deserves. In the 1960s, that monster wore beads and preached love. In later decades, others would take new shapes, but the blueprint remains: a voice that promises truth, followers who crave certainty, and a society too distracted to notice until it's too late. Manson's gift was understanding that chaos is contagious, and his legacy is proof that ideas can kill long after their author has turned to dust. Still, within the darkness, there is something to learn. The Manson story stands as a warning, written in blood and silence, that evil rarely announces itself with horns or fire. It comes singing, smiling, offering freedom. It looks like salvation until it's too late to turn back. That truth doesn't fade with time. It grows louder, retold in classrooms, echoed in films, whispered in fear whenever the world feels like it's losing its grip. According to official records, the Manson family murdered 9 people. But in a deeper sense, their true victim was trust, the fragile belief that humanity, at its core, is good. After August 1969, that belief was harder to hold. Today, the house at 10050 Cielo Drive no longer stands. It was demolished, erased from sight, as if destroying the walls could silence what happened there. Yet every August, strangers still leave flowers near where it once stood. Some come to mourn, others out of morbid curiosity. They stand in silence, surrounded by the hum of Los Angeles traffic, and for a brief moment, they feel the weight of history pressing down like a shadow. Maybe that's what Manson wanted all along: not immortality, but memory. To live forever in the spaces between horror and fascination. To remind the world that peace is fragile, that faith can curdle, that monsters are made, not born. In the end, Charles Manson was neither prophet nor devil. He was a mirror reflecting everything we fear and everything we might become if we stop questioning the voices that claim to save us. The murders ended long ago, but the echo, his echo, never did, and perhaps it never will.